You are listening to the Mind Shock Podcast. This is your host, Bruce McGuire, tackling a wide range of topics that the mainstream is obviously too terrified to address, let alone address logically. Case in point here, the subject of the day: where there's smoke, there's fire. And this is an old adage that is relevant to so many areas, not just individual known criminals. But when you have information leaking from certain areas, whether you're talking Assange or Snowden, there's certain leaks that happen. And there's, so to speak, smoke. So what is the origin of the smoke? Now, let's not fall for false dichotomy logical fallacies. Obviously, there's not always fire where there's smoke. There are certain situations where there could be smoke without fire. However, due to their rarity in proportion to when there is smoke because of fire, one would be a fool to dismiss the possibility of fire when there's smoke. Yet this is exactly what the Dunning-Kruger crowd, the coincidence theorists, the authority-worshipping cultists do. Time and time again, and that's what we're going to look at. As always, if you want to help support the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Help logic and reason return to a world where it is quickly going extinct. You could also become a YouTube member right here on YouTube. Help support the channel that way. Get access to exclusive streams and chats. Make sure you're subscribed, like and share, Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, Patreon. Patrons do get priority for case, topic, logical analysis, co-podcast, or requests. You can also be a guest of the podcast depending on your tier. Questions, comments, theories, thoughts, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings of any kind, leave them in the comment section. All right, so is it really that simple? So there's a couple other sayings that I go over. This is all in relation to conspiracy theory versus coincidence theory or state worship, expert worship, authority worship, scientism. All of these are basically the same thing. Individuals giving up their own ability to reason, to take on blind faith the words of corrupt and or fallible humans. This is really, at this point, in a post-widespread internet age, although you could argue, going back all the way to ancient Greece, that just the utilization of basic philosophy, just understanding basic logic is all that's required. You don't necessarily need access to all these declassified documents, Tuskegee, Gulf of Tonkin, Bay of Pigs, Operation Northwoods. You don't even need access to all that to simply understand that the corrupt criminal class, aka politicians, whatever you want to call them, some people call them the elite. Some people don't like the word elite. Elite means you're the best of the best. So I don't have a problem with calling the top of the criminal class. These are elite criminals. These politicians, the elites, they're elite criminals. They're swindling and extorting the masses to the tune of trillions of dollars. These are not your common thugs on the street. These are the elite of the elite when it comes to the criminal class. So I don't have a problem with calling these politicians elites. They're the best of the best when it comes to criminal scum. They're the cream of the crop. They do criminal scumbaggery better than anybody else. So they deserve that elite label. They are elite scum. You'd be hard-pressed to find scum operating at a higher level of scumbaggery than these scumbags. So anyway, circling back, these so-called elites, they are extorting the masses. They're engaged in criminal conspiracy each and every day. Let's throw out a couple of quotes that are pretty popular on the Mind Shock podcast if you've been listening to Mind Shock for a while. Upton Sinclair, of course, it is very difficult to get a man to believe something which his salary depends on him not believing. That's just a good one. Whether you're talking politics, scientism, that one is a good one. The big pharma cult. That one is just really, really good. George Carlin has a great one. You don't need a formal conspiracy when interests converge. Just like different churches, or even the same church in different countries, they're not going to blow the whistle on each other, threatening the institution. Just like various mafias work. Just like the institution of slavery. Even though slave plantation owners were technically in competition with each other, they might have rival cotton companies, whatever. They both need to protect the institution of slavery in order to make money, so they're going to keep the propaganda going. Just like with conspiracy theories. A lot of goofs, a lot of coincidence theorist goofs, obviously suffering from the Dunning-Kruger effect to such an extreme degree. They don't have the mental capacity to fathom that there doesn't even necessarily need to be a formal agreed upon conspiracy between nations or different groups, the UN, whoever, in order for them to be executing these conspiracies. They're just acting in their interest. Corruption, power. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. I mean, there's so many of them. I mean, Mark Twain's, it's easier to fool someone than convince them they've been fooled. And of course, the one we're specifically discussing today, where there's smoke, there's fire. So you got these criminal scum, Epstein, Maxwell, etc., trafficking. I mean, you have all of this exposed, even going back to the Franklin scandal in the 80s. Then you also had Boys Town. You had all of these so-called scandals. I mean, that's what the mainstream media calls a proven conspiracy. Instead of using the word conspiracy, obviously manufactured by the U.S. government to try to quell any kind of logic or critical thinking in the direction of the JFK assassination, which, if you haven't checked that out on Mindshock, make sure to check that out. We did a comprehensive analysis on that. More episodes coming, by the way, including an episode on whether or not JFK is still alive. But I digress. Let's go back to where there's smoke, there's fire. So all of these human trafficking rings, and especially of children, directly connected to politicians. I mean, this is a perfect example of where there's smoke, there's fire situation, because, I mean, Alex Jones has been ranting and raving about Epstein and these rings, similar to Ted Gunderson before him. And Bill Cooper, to a certain extent, some of these other guys, they've been talking about this stuff, staged false flags, human trafficking. Clearly there was smoke. Now, that doesn't mean that there's fire, but it does mean that the only logical position when confronted with this much evidence, even if it's circumstantial, even if it's not definitive, is to at least comprehend that it's very possible. Not that it's 100% definitive, but a lot of these goofs that hallucinate that the word conspiracy is synonymous with untruth, they're too mentally weak to even consider the possibility that just all of this smoke is coming from a fire. Again, not that it is. Maybe it's not. If you can explain away the variables, if you can prove the smoke is not coming from the fire, maybe it's not. Doesn't mean you need to believe either way. That's not what I'm claiming here. There's just endless goofs in the comments and on the streams commenting, thinking I'm making definitive claims about anything. I'm just looking at the logical aspect to all of these arguments for and against. And that's why the old adage, where there's smoke, there's fire, is pretty important when it comes to this stuff and many other things, just like a serial killer. So if somebody goes missing around a serial killer, a known serial killer has killed a lot of people. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean the serial killer is responsible. Maybe the serial killer is not. But you'd be a fool to dismiss the serial killer from the pool of suspects, if there's any other suspects at all, without definitively verifying that. And that's the point I'm making here, not to be confused with the shifting burden of proof logical fallacy. You don't claim that the serial killer is 100% responsible. That would be making a positive claim. But ruling the serial killer out, that's what the coincidence theorists do effectively. That's what these goofs do, because they're claiming that it's ludicrous that the government would be responsible for chemtrails or false flag operations. I mean, just look at the sheer amount of pure evil like MKUltra the government has openly admitted in declassified documents. Now, that's my question. The coincidence theorists, I don't think a single coincidence theorist or authority-worshipping cultist has answered this question. If they're willing to admit what they did, what would they not be willing to admit even if they did do it? I mean, people don't talk about Tuskegee or the poisoning of St. Louis that much. I mean, they had an op where they just sprayed these known toxic poisonous chemicals all over St. Louis. And there's goofs hallucinating that they wouldn't be experimenting with geoengineering, which of course is admitted with hundreds of patents. So, yeah, I mean, it's just, I mean, this level of goofery by coincidence theorists, I mean, not to fall for a hasty generalization logical fallacy, although I guess I am falling for it, is that coincidence theorists are just the goofiest of the goofs. I mean, can anybody think of a group of people sillier and more clueless than coincidence theorists, people who openly trust their government, who unequivocally will hand over whatever percentage of so-called taxes, whatever percentage is requested to be extorted from them, they freely hand it over. To be disarmed so they can't defend themselves against criminals, both the elite criminal class politicians, whatever you want to call them, those types of criminals, or just your average everyday criminal on the street, your so-called honest criminals, so at least criminals who aren't lying about what they're doing. I mean, it's actually a point. I think Larkin Rose made this point. Who's stolen more of your money, the government or just even not just one thief, but just private thieves, private sector thieves, non-government employed thieves? Because there's a certain honesty to a criminal who's not lying to you. When you get mugged on the street, the honest criminal, I mean, it's not honest work. Nobody's claiming that theft is honest itself. I'm saying a criminal who's being honest about the crime, who's being honest about robbing you, that's an honest criminal. Whereas a politician who's robbing you blind exponentially more than any private criminal, they're lying to you, pretending that they're robbing you for your own good. I mean, just one quick glance of inflation over the past century should clear that up for any goofs who might be having trouble comprehending that, or whether or not, or thinking the politician might actually be telling them the truth. I mean, there's a reason politicians and lawyers, I mean, you do need to add, post-COVID, you got to add doctors into this class. But when people, say that, basically, politicians are synonymous with lying. What's the old joke? How do you know a politician is lying? His mouth is open. And yet, clueless goofs are still trusting politicians in their government. If only they vote a different way. I mean, what's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing again and again and expecting different results. So when you have this Hegelian dialectic of voting, where there's this false choice. Now, that doesn't mean things can't be slightly better with one choice or another, and that doesn't mean there might not be honest disruptors, like non-politicians like Donald Trump being slipped into the mix. Now, again, whether he is or isn't controlled opposition, let's not fall for false dichotomies within false dichotomies. Because even if Trump is controlled op, he might be being used as a useful idiot where he doesn't realize he's controlled op. And if he's not as dumb as those trying to use him think he is, he actually might be able to make more positive changes than expected within his controlled op role. I haven't really heard anybody talk about that. But this is Mind Shock, where we go over every single angle and theory regarding everything. So I think that's a possibility as well. Again, I'm not claiming anything is true or untrue. I'm not claiming either theory is true or untrue. But here's the deal. Regarding where there's smoke, there's fire. You have long-standing track records of these political scum. I mean, whether you're talking the Bushes, the Clintons, the Obamas, these political mass-murdering genocidal scum with very clear track records. What would they not do? And again, they're all mostly used as useful idiots and puppets as well, figurehead positions. I'm not claiming they're not. But if all of this has been going on for X amount of time, I mean, not only is we're talking a smoke, there's fire situation. I mean, realistically, the comparison is you see a roaring blaze. I mean, it's like that Naked Gun scene, like, move along, nothing to see here. It's no longer a smoke, there's fire. There's roaring blazes everywhere, and coincidence theorists are still claiming there's no fire. I mean, not only is there smoke, I mean, the fire is burning your skin, and the coincidence theorists are claiming there's no fire. Now, pre 9/11, I suppose one could argue they're not really seeing the flames, or at least the flames aren't quite singeing their skin at that moment. Now, keep in mind, Bill Cooper was saying all these things in the 90s, even the late 80s, right? When did he come out? And then you also have precursors to Cooper like Serge Monast, Operation Bluebeam, and all of these things, the trans agenda. I mean, Serge Monast was going over this stuff in the 80s. Who knows where he got it? But these plans have just been in place for so long. I mean, we're actually well beyond a where there's smoke, there's fire situation. I mean, it's almost like that was more useful in what? The 80s. In the 80s, it's more like that would have been a more congruent argument. Now, there's roaring blazes everywhere, literally burning people's skin. And the coincidence theorists are still maintaining it's just that conspiracy is untruth, or that conspiracies can't be true and aren't true regarding, a plethora of all these different types of conspiracies. Now, it really is that simple. I mean, can anybody break it down simpler than that? I mean, there's one more concept I wanted to go over here. This is almost a trope at this point about coincidence theorists. I mean, I guess they're just that triggered about being wrong about everything the past couple years. They chastise so-called conspiracy theorists, critical thinkers, those who are corruption aware, whatever you want to call them. They kind of say, and they even thrown insults at Eddie Bravo for this, because he's flat out said whatever he sees on the idiot box on the mainstream media, he believes the opposite is true. And a lot of coincidence theorists and authority worshiping cultists, they say, well, that's kind of silly because maybe it is true. Now, here's my counter. I mean, yeah, that is a false dichotomy, obviously. But here's the thing. If you did the opposite of what your government told you, regardless of which country you live in, over the past 100 years, every situation, if you did the opposite, or you believed the opposite of whatever was purported as truth or recommended on the idiot box as part of the official narrative, would you be in a better position than the people who took it all on blind faith, lapped it up, bootlicked to the greatest extent possible? I mean, obviously, we're seeing this right now with a certain medical treatment, but and other medical treatments that were not recommended on the mainstream, and the comparisons between both in relation to a certain issue that we don't need to get into. But it's really that simple. So let's say whatever's on the idiot box is 99% wrong. So, yeah, if you just took the immediate position 100% of the time, you'd be wrong 1% of the time. Or if you really want to expand it, we can go 90-10. I mean, I don't know if anybody can make an argument for that the idiot box is correct more than 10% of the time. I'm not even sure they're correct 1% of the time. But whatever, let's give them that. Let's say they're wrong 90% of the time, correct 10%. So if you just automatically took the opposite of position of whatever's on the idiot box, whatever government officials are claiming as true on the idiot box, the mainstream media narrative regarding anything, regarding wars, regarding health, regarding voting, regarding whatever current events, so to speak, are going on. If you just always took the opposite position, what would your accuracy rating be? And would you be in a better or worse off position than the goofs who just took it all on blind faith despite these track records of fraud and failure going back hundreds of years? Now, obviously on Mind Shock, it's not really about belief. Belief is the enemy of knowing. That's another good quote. And another one that just popped into my head, the fool thinks he knows everything, the wise man knows he knows nothing. Because a lot of these coincidence theorist goofs, they're like, oh, that's just a conspiracy. That never happened. That's not true. So these goofs are claiming to know it's definitively not true. Whereas if you look at the average conspiracy theorist, they're not necessarily claiming the conspiracy is 100% true. They're just asking questions and examining theories and possibilities. They're being critical. They're utilizing critical thinking. What if what's presented on the idiot box actually isn't true? What if it's something else? I mean, then there's obviously mutually exclusive theories. What if certain humans in positions of power actually want to engage in nefarious and corrupt activities to gain more power or for the purpose of money. I mean, what a shocker. I mean, that's so out there and ludicrous. That could never be true, right? Coincidence theorists are a hilarious bunch. You have to give them that. But obviously, it's not necessarily that you're just going to believe the opposite, but a better position would probably be simply disbelieve whatever the official narrative is. That doesn't necessarily mean you need to take the opposite position and claim the opposite is definitely true, because then you get into those dicey areas of Hegelian dialectics and all of that, which I will be doing a dedicated episode on, the illusion of choices, the manufacturing of different choices, all of which are not in your best interest. But simply being scientifically skeptical, employing logic and reason of whatever narrative is propagated on the idiot box, that seems to be a safe position. I mean, George Carlin actually had a bit where he said, I believe nothing of what the government tells me. Nothing.
My first rule, I don't believe anything the government tells me. Nothing. Zero.
I mean, and this was years ago. I mean, you know, obviously he's passed for a while now, but I mean, this was years and years ago. I mean, his act has been relatively the same for quite a long time. Obviously, he ramped it up post 9/11 on the conspiracy side, but even before that, I mean, it's just kind of curious just regarding health and safety. There's another meme going around that modern medicine has done such a great job, there's hardly a healthy human left. And all the gullible goofs, the scientism worshippers, all these goofs who just endlessly, I mean, they literally will dig themselves into their own grave believing these fraudulent narratives at their own expense of themselves and their families, literally to the point that they actually die due to their blind faith in these corrupt and or fallible humans. I mean, Western medicine is what? It's admittedly the third leading cause of death. So those are the admitted numbers. One can only imagine what hasn't been counted or admitted. Again, not rocket science, but the goofs, they just have such a hard time with it. But here on Mindshock, we don't fall for these silly logical fallacies and blind faith in corrupt and fallible humans in so-called positions of authority. So that's it for now. Smoke, there's fire. You can apply that to anything. And just comparing coincidence theorists versus critically thinking conspiracy theorists, simply saying that there might be a fire if there's smoke, that there's a decent chance. There's possibly a greater than not chance that there is fire if there's smoke, while of course allowing for those remote possibilities where the smoke is caused by something that it's not fire. And it really boils down to being that simple. I mean, I don't know how to simplify it any further. Is it possible to dumb it down any further? I'm always trying to get better on Mindshock. I'm always trying to dumb things down as much as possible so that the most amount of people can comprehend it. But of course, the Dunning-Kruger effect, of which I have a major podcast coming up on that. And I also have a book. I have 2 books coming up. One of them is specifically on the Dunning-Kruger effect and the decline of Western civilization. So hope everybody enjoyed another edition of the Mindshock podcast, found it interesting and informative. If you want to help support the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. Hit that bell for notifications. If you're still not getting notifications, just like and comment on more videos, or you can just go to youtube.com/Mindshock. You could also become a YouTube member right here on YouTube. Help support the channel that way. Like and share Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, Patreon. Questions, comments, theories, thoughts, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings of any kind, leave them in the comment section. This is Bruce McGuire signing off. Catch you guys next time.